out of Canaan. They went into Egypt, and of course, they were there for a period of time. And in the days of Moses, there were plagues, just like there were when Sarah was taken by Pharaoh. And the plagues then bring the children of Israel out of Egypt back to Canaan. So you see the exact same scenario in miniature in Abraham's life as you see with Jacob leaving, going into Egypt, and then later the whole nation then coming back. But what happens when they come back, when Joshua enters Canaan, they begin to take the land from the Canaanites, and then eventually they come to David's day. David then establishes the location of the altar right on the place where Abraham offered Isaac. So you might say that the small cycle that you see in Abraham's life, leaving Canaan, going into Egypt, and leaving Canaan during the famine, going into Egypt, the plagues, then bringing Sarah back to Abraham, they leave Egypt. And if you look at the account, you'll notice that Abraham comes back to the very same spot that he left from. So he does, you might say, a circle. He completes the cycle, you might say. But in the case of Jacob, okay, the cycle really began with Abraham offering Isaac at Mount Moriah. So 3 generations later, Jacob leaves Egypt during a famine. They leaves Canaan during a famine, goes into Egypt. Then during the plagues, they leave Egypt and come back to Canaan. Then they subdue the Canaanites. Then David ends up then offering this sacrifice, which God accepts, at the same location where Abraham offers Isaac. So you have a much larger cycle this time, but it's the same events that are happening. Okay, so now we want to get back to the idea of the location. So after Abraham offers Isaac, Sarah dies, and then Abraham purchases the burying place for Sarah, and then later becomes the burying place for himself and others. So I don't want to say that I positively have this figured out, but I have a guess as to what's happening. I believe the reason why I'm not sure exactly why it's a different location, but let's say I'll give a thought as to why he purchased the threshing floor. What we're to understand from the purchase, not the threshing floor, but the cave of Machpelah. I believe Abraham could not purchase the cave for the living. It says he purchased it for the dead. It makes this point. You may remember the scripture in Romans. I believe it's in chapter 8. And it says that as long as a man is under the law, he's bound to it, like it's like marriage, and he's bound to the law or the wife is bound to the law of her husband as long as he lives. But when he dies, he's freed from the law of her husband, and that way we can be married to Christ, and he's really talking, I think, primarily to Jews who still felt they were under the law, and telling them that they really, when they come into Christ, they're not under the law anymore. They're freed when they die to self, and they're baptized into the baptism of Christ's death. then they're freed from all the ties that tie us to this world, and if they happen to have been under the Mosaic law at that time, they were no longer, it no longer had any hold on them. But this is not to say that they didn't have, obligations to do right. That's not the intent. But the intent is that now legally they're under Christ, and He is their head, and it's no longer Moses. So, so the idea of the cave is that Abraham could not purchase the cave for the living, and I believe the reason why is because at that time it pictured a time when Christ had not died yet, so He Himself could not have any inheritance in Canaan. So that would then say that the way you get into Canaan and inherit Canaan is through Christ, and that I believe is demonstrated, and hopefully we'll get to that a little bit later on. But so Abraham, you might say, dies. He, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all and his family, they die in hope of one day being raised from the dead and being able to then inherit all the blessings that God had promised Abraham. So then the question is or another question that came to my mind when I was looking at this is that I wondered if Abraham, if he couldn't he couldn't purchase it for the living, he didn't have that capability, so he purchased it for the dead. How is it in some way then Abraham has to be redeemed? He's buried in this cave, he and his family, and I believe that what in fact happens is that when Israel re-enters Canaan, and David purchases the threshing floor, that I think what will turn out to be true, and that's why I say this is a guess, is that we'll find, and I believe it's probably hidden in the story, that the land is redeemed, and Abraham is considered to be legal owner of that land in death, and so that when the land is redeemed, Abraham is redeemed with the land, and he is able to be raised from the dead. So in other words, I think the whole point of the cave, the purchase of the cave, was to, you might say, be a provision or a way that would demonstrate that Abraham was going to live again, and he was going to himself realize the fulfillment of the promises. It would